Hello, my name is Christoph Luykx, and I'm the policy director at Orgalim, and it's really my pleasure. I would like to thank the organizers for having me and having Orgalim here to talk about some of Europe's cybersecurity challenges. And I know many of you have already been discussing and will be discussing a lot of these aspects, but I think what maybe is slightly different is that I'm going to focus on the regulatory side of the discussion. And specifically about a big challenge, which is regulatory fragmentation. So just to kind of highlight what I am going to talk about and how I want to structure it. First, I will say a couple of words about Orgalim and Europe's technology industries, because this will be important to understand the angle from which we are looking at these issues. Then I'll talk about why it is important, cybersecurity. I won't spend a lot of time on that because for this audience, I know you're already convinced. But it's important that I say a couple of words about that. But then I'll go very quickly into what is happening to kind of outline what we see as Orgalim and Europe's technology industries within the cybersecurity policy landscape and how that's impacting our industries. And I will then conclude with a bit of a discussion on, given all of this, what is the way forward and how do we address some of the potential challenges that we are facing as an industry. So those are kind of the points I wanted to address. Maybe first of all, to explain a bit like which angle are we looking at it from? So who are we representing? So it's important to know that we are representing three big sectors: mechanical engineering, metal technologies, and electrical engineering, electronics, and ICT. Now you see from the figures that this is a huge part of Europe's industrial base, specifically the manufacturing base. And so that's why you will see also in our positions that we will be taking that there are a couple of maybe different approaches than what you're looking at, but in general, of course, I think there is a great alignment across industry on some of these challenges. But so this is who we represent. Now, how are we structured? We are what we call a federation. So we represent 46 member associations from 22 countries. So you'll see here on this slide all of the countries that we are representing and which of the other associations we are representing. That doesn't mean that we don't have corporate direct engagement. We do. So we have a lot of some of the bigger corporations here, European corporations, active in our working. So it's not that we're talking cybersecurity in abstract. We do have the direct corporate input, but the membership is specifically focused on associations. So I think this is important for you to know, to understand how are we actually looking and approaching the discussion on cybersecurity. Now, why it matters? Again, for this audience of CISOs and others, I should not convince you about the importance of cybersecurity. So I know that, but what I think is important and why it matters is more why it matters to Europe to get this right. And this is a discussion a bit that we are looking at also as Orgalim specifically is around the role of advanced manufacturing. And advanced manufacturing as a strategic differentiator for Europe. Now, I think most of you know what we are talking about when we talk about advanced manufacturing. So it's kind of the marrying of OT, operational technologies, with the IT side, which of course creates a lot of the new opportunities for Europe's industries. But also some of the challenges, and you'll see that in the bottom of the slide. But on its importance, it is important, and one of our missions as Orgalim is also to make sure that the policymakers see its importance. And on this, I just want to mention a point about something that has happened in the last couple of weeks, which is the European Commission has kind of released an update to an industrial strategy they did last year in 2020. Why an update? Well, because of course, due to the COVID situation, there were many things that happened in the meantime. And so they thought we needed to do an update to that strategy of the beginning of 2020. Now, what you will see if you would look at that updated industrial strategy is that it specifically also calls out advanced manufacturing. And in some of the accompanying documents, very specifically, they talk about advanced manufacturing and the fact that Europe is actually at the forefront of advanced manufacturing, that this is a great asset for Europe's economies. And so it's clear to the policymakers that advanced manufacturing is core. Now, where it stops short, and this is what Orgalim will continue to advocate for, is how do we maintain that leadership? how do we ensure that Europe remains a leader in advanced manufacturing and that we are building on the advantages that we already have in Europe? Now, that will require a couple of things, and you see that on this slide. With regards to investments, we need to focus on investments in advanced manufacturing skills. We need to avoid fragmentation, and this is specifically also where cybersecurity will come in. I'll talk about that in a moment. So we need to make sure that whatever we do across Europe and all of its member states, we take the same line, the same direction, and to make sure that advanced manufacturing is going to be that strength and continues to be that strength for our economy. So that's kind of to say why we think cybersecurity is important for our industries, specifically also in the context of advanced manufacturing. So again, marrying advanced manufacturing and cybersecurity, it's clear that we need to get this right. We need to get cybersecurity right and how we deal with that if we want to continue advanced manufacturing and the lead in that space. We also know that manufacturers and our members are already treating cybersecurity as a core priority, as well as you do. Right? At the same time, also, we all need to acknowledge that even though you are at the forefront of these discussions, there are still organizations, companies that probably could do more. And I think that's our mission, your mission, also with this conference, but also ours as an organization to ensure that we educate also other industry players with regards to why it is important and what needs to be done. And I think specifically also when you look at some of the small and medium-sized enterprises, I think it is a challenge for them to keep track also of the latest developments. And so the question needs to be, how do we address this? And I'll come back to that also in a moment. So in general, some of the other challenges, if you look at advanced manufacturing and the marrying of OT and IT, where a manufacturing product, let me give the example of, let's say, a product that goes on an automation line, where it might have been a bit more of a static thing in the past. Now, with integrating a lot of the, let's say, digitalization, it's clear that is not as static as it should be. There's going to be updates, etc. So how do we deal with that? So the speed of change is going to increase as an industry, and we are handling that, but it will raise some challenges and maybe potentially also around cybersecurity. Now, this other point that you see here on the slide, the risk of entanglement in B2C discussions. There's a lot of discussions currently, of course, that are being driven by, let's say, consumer aspects, consumer discussions, and which are creating, rightfully so, a lot of questions. But it might also mean that some of those discussions will be brought to the B2B space or the industrial space, and they might not be the same discussions. So I think our job also is to talk to policymakers and to disentangle some of these discussions and make clear what is happening in the industrial space is not always the same as what is happening at the threat level, for example, in the consumer space. Now, there will be overlaps, but it's not just a one-on-one. And so this is an interesting challenge that we'll have to address. Cost, increased cost, especially also for small, medium-sized enterprises, is something we need to take into account. Skills. And finally, again, for you, not a secret, for a lot of policymakers, it's good to kind of repeat this. Global supply chains. We are integrated as industries. And so whatever we do in Europe will have an impact on our global supply chain, or whatever the United States does, or China, or Japan, or other parts of the world. And so this kind of constant request that we have to policymakers for international dialogue and discussion, standardization, that's still at the forefront of what we're doing. It's not always an easy discussion, and I'll talk about that also in a moment. But it is important to keep focusing on that. But it doesn't make the discussions easier. So this is just kind of a quick discussion on why it matters from an advanced manufacturing perspective and how we see advanced manufacturing linking to some of the cybersecurity discussions and why it is crucial to get this right to be a leader on advanced manufacturing. So that's the first big part. Now going into the second big part, which is what is actually happening out there? What is taking place? And specifically from a regulatory perspective. So here are some of the drivers that we have been seeing, and this is looking at it from a European angle, but clearly a lot of these drivers are the same in other parts of the world. And as I mentioned before, a lot of the issues are driven by consumer concerns issues that are happening in the consumer space. And so we need to be mindful of the fact that that is there, that is happening. And the fact that you say we are in a B2B space in an industrial context, so we shouldn't worry about that. To some extent, that's true, but we cannot ignore it, because whatever goes and happens in that space will affect us down the road. So that's one big driver. So that's why I also say increasingly the B2B context is becoming into scope, issues that we're seeing around cybersecurity. And as I said, also the link to the broader global discussions on industrial strategies. The example, give you one concrete example, the concerns about where is a product made, and the link that some policymakers are making to its level of security just based on where it's made. It's a challenge, and it's going to increase. And so how do we reestablish trust on that front, right? It's not per se where a product is made, it is how it is made, and what are the checks built in around that. But at the same time, those concerns are there, and it's driving a lot of the debate on industrial strategies, and how should we focus on a European cybersecurity sector. All very valid, but how do we make all of these connecting dots work? So all of these drivers are driving a lot of the political attention. And not just attention, because obviously that attention is translating itself into a wide variety of actions. And so on the next slide here, you can see, and this is just at the European level, and this is not even exhaustive, what is happening around cybersecurity. So it's a top priority for the European Commission, for the member states, and they've acknowledged that in a wide variety of documents. Now, concretely, there was a Cybersecurity Act a couple of years ago, and a big focus on that was on certifications. There was also a creation of this Cybersecurity Stakeholder Certification Group, or the SCCG, of which I'm a member, and which is driving, as a start, a lot of the discussions on, for example, cloud certification and other areas of certification, all starting from a perspective of it's voluntary. However, we also believe that some of these might start becoming mandatory down the road. And so as Orgalim, we're very happy to be part of this stakeholder group, to be part of that discussion and make sure that the voluntary aspect still remains the main way that we're dealing with certifications. So this broad discussion on certifications is taking place across Europe, and this is something that we're really focused on. The Network and Information Security Directive, or NIS, which is currently in place, has now let's say, a review going on. So there is a proposal currently making its way in the European Parliament and together with the member states. It's called the NIS2. And so as Orgalim, we're actively participating in that. I'll say something about that in the next slide. That's an example of some very big, wide-ranging piece of legislation on cybersecurity. And then within what we call the framework of the new legislative framework, NLF, there's a couple of pieces of legislation. Some of you might be familiar with the Radio Equipment Directive or with the Machinery Directive, which also now has a new proposal, Machinery Regulation, the Low Voltage Directive, the review of the General Product Safety Directive. So there's all of these specific, more technical pieces of legislation, which actually are also being increasingly looked at as having cybersecurity angles, or where the European Commission is looking at inserting cybersecurity requirements. And then last but not least, of course, this is the European level, but then at the national level in the different member states, there is almost the same wide variety of activities with regards to cybersecurity, be it legislation, certification, or other actions. So if you throw that all together, it's clear that it becomes a very comprehensive, but also potentially complex picture. So as I promised you, this is just, I have one or two slides, sorry, on the NIS2 with regards to what some of the new obligations are. An important change with this NIS is that the scope has been broadened. I'm not going to go into details about how. You see that here in the second bullet point, but it's clear, including a lot of our sectors are now being added to this piece of legislation. And there's going to be a lot of obligations that those industries will have to focus on, be it from governance, risk management perspective, reporting obligations, supervisional elements. So it's clearly going to impact a much wider set of the industry compared to the past. And you see here also the last point here, there's specific focus on supply chains, because cybersecurity, you might push just this part of the supply chain, certain requirements, but automatically, and this is, you know that, and you've seen that, some of these things might trickle down or go up via supplier agreements or your clients, your customers requiring a couple of things to demonstrate that you've done a couple of things. So this whole debate about supply chain, you will see a lot of these requirements, even if you're not in scope, they might come down to you, but indirectly via these kind of agreements and contracts. So I think that's an important element to know. Even though you might think, I'm not in scope, you will have to closely track this. Now, what are some of the discussions currently in the Parliament that we are engaging in? It's a wide variety of topics, but the scope, who is in scope, it's still something we're focusing on. Specifically, our focus is on the smaller companies. They should not have the same obligations as, let's say, the big multinational corporations. There's going to be a lot of discussion still on definitions, on the obligations. Certification, you see that on the right. Certification, what I just mentioned, voluntary or mandatory. So a lot of debate on that, and this is also concerning products, right? This is not just organizational requirements that you have to do as an organization, incident reporting, but it's about your products. So this is going to be an important dimension too. The fines, what does it mean to be a proportional fine? So some of you, of course, have been working on the privacy legislation here, the GDPR in Europe, with the fines attached to it. So a lot of these discussions will take place now over the next year, and I definitely would recommend for all of you to keep a close eye on that. Before I now go to the last stage of my presentation, which is like the way forward, I think there's three key aspects I want to call out. It's about context, consistency, and cost. And I think these three key aspects are something that should guide us in our discussions with policymakers, and it should guide the policymakers in thinking about cybersecurity in a way that also helps industry. So let me clarify that. On context, it goes a bit to what I said earlier about the B2C space is not the same as the B2B space. The risks are different in B2C and in B2B. It depends on the kind of like what industry are you looking at, how cybersecurity needs to be implemented. So context means look at the risk profile, right? So context is going to be important when you're looking at legislation. It's difficult to do always a one-size-fits-all, especially if you're going to go into a detailed approach. If you stay at a higher level and you leave industry the ability to kind of implement, that could be the right approach. But I think where we're going with a lot of this is the level of detail will be very significant. And so then the difficulty will be, how do you make sure that it applies in a efficient manner across the board? So that discussion is an important one. When I talk about consistency, that's the point about there's so many activities going on, there's so many requirements coming to industry, and the risk of fragmentation is going to be real. And fragmentation from the perspective, not just the fact that there's so many things, and so how do you as a company kind of comply with all of this, but also potentially conflicting requirements. Because let's look at the manufacturing space, of course. When we put a machine in the market, it doesn't only apply sometimes or needs to comply with this directive or legislation. It might have other pieces of legislation applying to it. And if we will have diverging requirements in those pieces of legislation, so the same machine suddenly needs to be faced with different obligations. So that's something we're very much concerned about. And it links to the third part also, it's kind of the cost, right? This cost point is linked to the context and consistency. It's clear that a lot of the new requirements will increase cost. And this means more personnel, which, this is the positive side for some of you, is that it might make it easier within the security side and bringing that to the board in your organizations to say, look, we need to do this, so give me more resources. At the same time, it needs to be reasonable, right? And so that's something that we will also be very much focusing on. It's not, for example, certification should not be the answer to everything, because it will have a significant cost attached to it. And especially in these days when we're still recovering our industries also from kind of the COVID crisis, we need to keep this element in mind. And it's not that we're saying we shouldn't do anything, to be very clear about that. But if they're more cost-efficient manners, we should look at that before we go to the more expensive one. So the way forward, let me just dive into a specific area here, which is, I just mentioned also the new legislative framework, the NLF, which has a wide range of directives underneath it, which has a couple of advantages when it comes to also the CE marking, etc. I'm not going to go into the details. It can become relatively technical, but what you need to understand, this system has been functioning for a long time in a decent way. Increasingly, so this is what you see here, right? You have on the left all of these different directives. They come together, and then they try to cover a wide range of products on the right. Now, what we are seeing, and the radio equipment directive with the delegated act there, is one example of where increasingly cybersecurity requirements are being put into these different pieces of legislation. And so the risk now is that we're having to discuss in the European Parliament with member states all of these pieces of legislation and saying, well, you're moving the piece here, but at the same time, be mindful that you're moving the piece on this legislation on cybersecurity in that direction, but there will be products that actually have to comply with all of this. So how do you keep consistency? To my earlier point about the risk of fragmentation, this picture is what we're afraid of, that you will have different requirements across the different directives related to cybersecurity. So the solution that we have put on the table, and this is, I believe, a very strong statement that industry is not just sitting back. So half a year ago, we went to the European Commission and we said, look, we want legislation. And for some people that might sound weird, industry asking for legislation, but we said, we want legislation to avoid fragmentation. So we want some horizontal piece of legislation within this NLF framework that will address cybersecurity, which then also would avoid, to go back to this, that you have these kind of like different approaches across the different legislation. So you could say there's kind of some kind of chapeau legislation across that. That's where you deal with cybersecurity. The challenge is the train has left the station on some of these things already. So we're still trying to advocate for this and make this a reality. It's going to be tough, but that's where we also need your help. And I'll say something about that in my last slide. But what you need to remember from this is industry, Orgalim, and our members are taking a proactive approach to avoid fragmentation, to keep the cost to a reasonable level, and to make sure that risk is going to be the driver and how you're looking at all of this. Again, we're summarizing in this slide a little bit what we think are advantages of the proposal that we have on legislation. From the perspective, and I think this is really important, the fourth bullet point, when we look at the free movement of goods, if you have one set of rules for goods, products moving across the borders within Europe, it's just the best way to do this and to make it as seamless as possible. And that's why you need to have one legislation applying to that machine or that product that is moving across the borders. So I'm wrapping up here. So this was kind of a very specific way forward. Now, as I said, some of these pieces of legislation are already out of the station. The NIS2, it is out there. So we are engaging on that already. But I hope you're, based on this presentation, you also share with me the feeling that we need to get this right. And we need to talk to policymakers about getting this right. And advanced manufacturing is a really nice example of IT/OT coming together, cybersecurity challenges being there. But the answer from a policy perspective cannot just be, let's throw different things at it. It needs to be consistent, it needs to be based on risk, and it needs to take into account the cost element. So I will end my presentation with the call to action that I just promised. One, do engage with policymakers. Bring real life examples on how you're dealing with cybersecurity within the organization, but also when it relates to your products. Bring those examples to the policymakers. We're more than happy to engage with you. So come to us as Orgalim or to any other of our other associations we work closely with. But it's important to increase that voice, and especially at the national level that you engage there, so that policymakers understand how this works and what some of the challenges are. So engage in the policy debate, and let's hope that we will manage to then get all of these moving pieces in the right direction. Not just in Europe, of course, have that debate also with the other regions in the world, and advocate for as much as possible global solutions to the cybersecurity challenge. So that was my short presentation. I look forward to your questions. And as always, of course, if not possible via this conference, you can always reach out to me afterwards. So thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to your questions and talk soon.